How can countries manipulate its currency, and can they sustain this for a long period of time? Let's take a look. So to understand currency manipulation, I'm going to start by looking at fixing your currency to another country's currency. Okay, so if a country wanted to fix its currency to another one so that exchange rate could not fluctuate between the two, how would they do so? And understanding that is going to help you understand how you can then manipulate your currency as well, because that is a form of currency manipulation. Fixing your currency to another currency, you may think, well, this is not allowing it to float. It's not a good thing. You're either going to be overvalued or undervalued. And I agree. But at the same time, when you think of a country large enough, or you think of the European Union, which encompasses many countries, in those situations, if you were to split the European Union euro into all of the individual currencies, some of them would have gained value relative to others over the past years, just because all of a sudden this country is doing a lot better in terms of its economy versus another one. So this one should have gained value relative to the other one. And the same thing can happen within the country. It could also be that in some instances, some provinces in Canada should have gained value relative to others if all of the provinces had their own currency. So fixing yourself to another country is not as realistic as letting it float. But when you have a large enough country, or you have the euro, that's also what's going on there. So how would you go about fixing your currency to another country? So to do this, the country that wants to fix to the other country is the one that's going to be doing all of the actions to be able to keep that exchange rate stable throughout the years between these two countries. The one that's being fixed at is just doing its own thing. The other one's kind of the one that has to adjust over time. So let's say the US has their currency and Canada wants to keep our rate with the US constant. It doesn't have to be 1-to-1. So if the current rate is, let's say, 1.4 Canadian dollars for $1 US, we can start with that rate, but we could just say, let's start here and let's just keep that exchange rate constant over time. So how would we do this? Well, the Bank of Canada would have to start with a lot of foreign reserves. So in this case, a lot of American reserves in their vaults. They would have to have a lot of that money. So let's just start with the fact that the Bank of Canada holds a lot of American reserves. And then what would have to happen is, let's say the American dollar is worth the same amount as Canadian. If the Canadian dollar were to go up in value, if we were to allow it to float, to change over time as a flexible exchange rate system would, what the Bank of Canada has to do is it has to bring down its value. So it has to keep it what we will call later as artificially low, because the value should have gone up, but we're keeping it worth less. And if the value were to go down, we would have to bring back its value. So we would keep it artificially high. So how can the Bank of Canada make its currency that should have been worth more, worth less? Well, the big idea here is that if you're making the Canadian currency more available, you're going to bring down its value. It's just like any other good out there. If there's a certain amount of cars available and you flood the market with cars, it's going to bring down its value. So if the Canadian dollar wants to go up in value and we flood the market with Canadian dollars, it's going to bring down its value. Same thing with the US dollar. The US dollar is worth too low relative to the Canadian. So we want to bring up its value in between the two. And therefore, if you make that US dollar more rare, you're going to bring up its value relative to the Canadian. So the Bank of Canada, to keep its currency artificially low, would have to sell Canadian dollars and buy US currency at the same time. So it's creating more Canadian dollars in the market, bringing down its value, taking American away, bringing up its value. So it's going to bring us back to that predetermined exchange rate that we wanted. If, on the other hand, the Canadian currency should have lost value, well, to avoid that, they need to prop up its value. So they're going to take Canadian dollars off the market, and they're going to have to flood the market with US dollars. When I say flood, it's just exchange for that. It's just to a large enough extent that it's going to bring down the value of the US relative to the Canadian, and it's going to bring up the value of the Canadian. So we come back to that exchange rate that was predetermined as well. In those two instances, there's only one that could be sustained for long periods of time, and that one is keeping the currency artificially low. And the reason for that is Canada will never run out of its own reserves. It could always print more money, more Canadian dollars, to sell that Canadian dollars and buy back US currency. So that process has no limit. However, the other process of keeping the currency artificially high has a limit, because if your way that you can keep the currency artificially high is by selling your US reserves to buy back Canadian, at some point you're going to run out of those US reserves. And if we look historically, if you were to look at the Mexican peso crisis, this is what happened. At some point, the Mexican currency was fixed to the US, and because of political turmoil and other reasons, the value of the peso should have fallen, but to keep it fixed, they kept it artificially high. And at one point, they ran low on US reserves, and then they couldn't go through the process anymore, and the currency dropped drastically in value overnight. So that situation of artificially high cannot be sustained for long periods of time. Keeping the currency artificially low can. And if we look at a country that's been argued to keep its currency artificially low, it is the Chinese currency. And the Chinese currency is not fixed to another currency, but they decide what rate should make sense. And because of that, there is the idea that there is some manipulation going on there. And the way that you can keep your currency artificially low, like I said before, is as they buy a lot of foreign reserves with their own currency. So when it comes to China and its US reserves, those are counted in trillions of dollars. It depends on if you just count treasury bills or other things that are denominated in US currency. That could go between about $1 to $3 trillion worth of US reserves that they have. And that allows them in certain instances to just offload a lot of treasury bills. So in certain moments, they've offloaded about 50 billion worth of treasury bills rapidly, which has an impact on their currency, but it also has impact on, if we're talking about bonds here, on the interest rate in the bond market and everything else at the same time. So countries like China are able to keep their currency artificially low because that can be sustained for a long period of time, and that leads to a large accumulation of foreign reserves over time. So manipulation is easier to keeping your currency low than to keep it high. And keeping your currency low, the reason why you would do so, although it hurts your domestic consumers, citizens, when they go to travel abroad, they can't afford as much because their currency is not worth as much. And it's harder to import goods because they're more costly because your currency is worth less than it should. You're actually favoring your economy because if your currency is worth less, you export more and you import less. So you're favoring trade surpluses with various countries, which is a good thing for your economy. So although a weak currency is bad for you as a traveler, for you as a buyer of international goods, it's a good thing for your country in terms of production and the economy in general. So always keep that in mind. Weak currency, good for the economy generally. High currency, good for the buyer, for the traveler. So keeping currency weak was good for the Chinese economy for sure. So hopefully with this video, you can understand how to fix your currency to another country's currency and whether you can sustain that over time. Yes, if it stays close to what the actual level should be over time. It goes up and down. Well, then it's easy. If this should be the value and it's doing this over time, very easy to sustain. If it's worth more and you're keeping it artificially low, like you're bringing down its value, that's easy to sustain over time. But keeping it artificially high for long periods of time is hard. So hopefully you understand that whole process in currency manipulation better, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing or joining my class where I guide you to apply and expand on the information found in these videos to real-life examples. Have a good day.